Hello everyone, my name is Natalia Cis, and this is my presentation. Today I'll be analyzing Invisible Man, which is a novel by the American writer Ralph Ellison, which was first published in 1952. From the very beginning, we learn something special about the narrator, that he is invisible. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but this one sentence that says, "I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me," to what I would add for who he is. Anyway, the narrator writes in the first person, emphasizing his individual experiences and feelings about events portrayed in his life. Throughout the novel, he is subject to multiple humiliating experiences that lead him to acknowledge his invisibility. There's nothing more that the narrator wants than to be seen as an individual, and the whole story is how he tries and tries to form a unique identity for himself, to become visible. However, in this society, as in any other, racist expectations label what he should be and how he should act. Living through the lenses of others' expectations, whether they are black people or white people, the narrator feels unseen or invisible. In his quest for his identity, he denies who he really is and his roots. He creates an identity that will make others proud. So, my thesis statement is the following. In Invisible Man, the narrator goes from darkness, that is invisibility and blindness, to the light, his visibility, when he sets off on a quest for his identity, moving away from racial expectations. So first of all, I'd like to talk about white men, especially the town highest ranking citizens. After the narrator's high school graduation, he's invited to deliver the same speech in front of important white men, but instead he ends up fighting blindfolded and amusing his audience, and not through his intellect. One of the stereotypical ways of seeing black people is that they're violent and dangerous, so boxing would be a natural activity for a black man to do. This circus goes on as they have to collect their money, their prize, from an electrified mat, and the coins they retrieve end up being brass tokens. Before they even start picking up the coins, the narrator hears one man yelling, "This ought to be good." And then while they're doing it, another one says, "Pick it up, goddammit, pick it up." White men are portrayed in this story as believing that black men are a tool for entertainment. Cruel entertainment and humiliating entertainment. What is important here is that the narrator blindly and proudly accepts the briefcase and the scholarship as a prize, which shows his invisibility, as he doesn't want to fight or get electrocuted, but he does it anyway, conforming to the situation. Then, at college, he tries to do away with his Southern heritage, as he tries to cover his blackness with what he learns at school, right? He becomes educated and eloquent because he does away with his past, and he embraces white manners and ideologies to fit in. The bronze statue of the founder and a kneeling slave at school symbolizes that this college is supposed to enlighten students through their education, as the veil of the slave of the statue is being lifted. However, the narrator states that, "I am puzzled, unable to decide whether the veil is really being lifted or lowered more firmly into place, whether I am witnessing a revelation or a more efficient blinding." And the image of the statue revisits him at different points in the novel. The narrator is unsure of his identity, but he knows that he wants to make a name for himself within the black community as a successful college student, well, later on in Harlem as a community leader in the Brotherhood, but we'll get there in a sec. So now I'd like to say a few words on Dr. Bledsoe. Dr. Bledsoe is a very important character since he's the president of the college, and his ideology represents to some extent the ideology of the school. At first, the narrator idealizes Dr. Bledsoe and follows him with blind devotion because of his power, what he has built, his relations with white men, you name it. The narrator says, "He was the example of everything I hoped to be. Influential with wealthy men all over the country, consulted in matters concerning the race, a leader for his people, the possessor of not one but 2 Cadillacs, a good salary, and a soft, good-looking, and creamy-complexioned wife." He blindly follows Bledsoe's philosophy that white is right, hoping that he will earn the same prestige. Not until later on, after he's expelled, does he realize Dr. Bledsoe's true colors. A man who only desires to maintain his status and power. He's not a guy who wants to better his students' lives. Other than that, he proves to be a deceitful man. When the narrator gets the 7 letters which are addressed to the white trustees, he is instructed on the fact that these letters will be sealed. Don't open them if you want help. Because one of them will do something for you. He's completely blind to his reality. He has been expelled, and he has been told lies in order to get rid of him. In New York, he thinks about opening these letters with steam, but in the end he doesn't, because he always does what he's told, so he conforms. Not until he delivers the last letter that he learns that he shall never, under any circumstances, be enrolled as a student here again. Even if Dr. Bledsoe promised the narrator that if he worked hard, he could come back to campus the following fall, in the letter, we know for sure that he won't. And in the letter, too, it is suggested that the narrator is dangerous and that contact with him should be completely avoided. The narrator had been so blind that he had been unable to see that Dr. Bledsoe had tampered with his chances to get a job and progress. He does get a job, eventually, at Liberty Paint's factory. I'm just going to skip to the juicy stuff. However, in the forum, we could perhaps discuss optic, white paint, dope, and the character of Lucius Brockway. But let me get back to this. Even though he spends very little time at the factory, everyone has an idea of who the narrator is. Mr. Kimbrough thinks that the narrator is incompetent and a fool. From the very beginning, he told him, "You have to follow directions, and you're going to be doing things you don't understand, so get your orders the first time and get them right." He also said, "Never mind how it looks. That's my worry. You just do what you're told and don't try to think about it." In his eyes, the narrator, as any black person, is a man who can't think, or who shouldn't think. In order to comply with this role of a good employee, when Mr. Kimbrough asked him how the next batch of paint had turned up, he answered, "I don't know," I said, picking up a sample and hesitating. Moving on, the people at the union also cast judgment, and the narrator is speechless when he hears that they have called him a snitch, and he is unable to speak for himself in the beginning. A union member says, "Who sent this Fink into the meeting, brother chairman? Ask him that." The narrator can barely explain that this is his first day, and many don't even believe him. He has no voice. He is invisible. In the end, they take a boat and they just let him through to get his lunch. Finally, let me say a few things on Brockway, because Brockway believes that the narrator is a liar. At first, he believes that he's after his job because he's college educated. He asks him about what he has learned in school, and when the narrator answers, he says, "Is that so?" he said doubtfully. However, after the narrator returns, explaining that his tardiness is due to a union meeting, Brockway just loses it, and he yells, "I know you belonged to that bunch of troublemaking foreigners," and attacks him. To sum up, because of racial expectations, the invisible narrator in one day has acquired many stereotypical characteristics. He is useless, a snitch, and a liar. Let's move on to the factory hospital after the accident. Even though he's not injured, doctors think that he should stay under observation because they believe that he has a mental illness. Why wouldn't he, right? He's black. In order to cure him, he undergoes shock therapy, and that erases his memory. At one point, they even consider a prefrontal lobotomy and castration to treat him, just because he's black, you know. When they're discussing a way to proceed with the case, one of the doctors argues, "I don't know, but I believe it a mistake to assume that solutions, cures, that apply in primitive instances, are equally effective when more advanced conditions are in question. Suppose it were a New Englander with a Harvard background. So they don't know anything about him, since he doesn't remember anything, but the doctors are able to judge him based on the color of his skin. He becomes, in this case, invisible because of his identity is again associated with the stereotype that black men are crazy. And what is really important about this chapter is that it is a new beginning for this man. His past has been erased, and he will have to create a new identity for himself. The narrator is faced, perhaps for the first time, with questions of who he is and where he came from. For instance, when the doctors ask him time and time again, "Who are you?" The narrator realized that I no longer knew my own name, subsequently fretting over my identity. Later on, he's freed from the glass enclosure he had been in, and a cord is removed from his stomach. I felt a tug at my belly and looked down to see one of the physicians pull the cord, which was attached to my stomach node, jerking me forward. This symbolizes the rebirth of the narrator, metaphorically, as if the doctors were cutting his umbilical cord, and therefore his identity. For the first time, he can see light, and from now on, his journey to visibility, to the visibility of his identity begins. So his beliefs from now on have shifted. When he arrives to the man's house, where he has lived up to this point in New York, he encounters cultural leaders, educators, and university students. All these characters he faces in the house are the past, the one that he's leaving behind. He said, "The moment I entered the bright, buzzing lobby of the man's house, I was overcome by a sense of alienation and hostility. My overalls were causing stares, and I knew I could live there no longer, that phase of my life was past." As he was heading upstairs, he believed that he had spotted Bledsoe, and lifted it shining, full and foul, and moved forward 2 steps, dumping its great brown, transparent splash upon the head. In the end, it wasn't him. This is the first time that the narrator takes action and fights against someone who has done him wrong. He's growing from a naive college student to an adult. He's also beginning to go back to his roots. While at Mary's, he goes out for a walk and finds a man selling yams. At first, he only orders one, not knowing whether they are any good, but then he goes back for more. The man says, "I can see you a serious yam eater, young fellow. And also, I can see you one of these old-fashioned yam eaters." So, I have spoken about white men, but let me say a few words about white women, okay? So, they see the narrator as a sexually powerful black buck, a black man stereotype. Hubbard's wife is one example, since she invites him for a cup of coffee to talk about ideology, when in fact she just wants to seduce him. And she says, "I must confess that you also make me a friend." Yes, primitive. No one has told you, brother, that at times you have tom-toms beating in your voice. So, the narrator makes her a friend. He's primitive, and his voice sounds like drums, perhaps African drums. Another example is Sybil, another white woman. She calls him anonymous, brute, and beautiful buck. If he's anonymous, he's no one. He's invisible. Sybil seeks to act out a sexual fantasy that she has, of being raped by a black man. This idea perpetuates that black men are brutes and rapists, and none of these stereotypes are what the narrator really is. However, this is what he's expected to be. Now let me move on to Ras the Exhorter, later known as the Destroyer. He's a West Indian black man who believes that black men should fight against whites. The way he sees it, the narrator, as a black man, is a traitor, since he allows a white organization, the Brotherhood, to speak in Harlem about their social needs. While fighting the narrator, he calls him an Uncle Tom. "Get up, Uncle Tom," he said, and I clipped him. According to Webster, an Uncle Tom is a black person who is overeager to win the approval of whites, as by obsequious behavior or uncritical acceptance of white values and goals. The night of the riots, Ras says, "Hang him up to teach the black people a lesson, and there be no more traitors, no more Uncle Toms." The stereotype here is that all black people should have other black people's back. If not, they're traitors. The narrator, once again, is not supposed to think. He has to conform to what he's supposed to do. So now, finally, let's move on and talk about Brotherhood. When he accepts this new job, he takes on a new name. Brother Jack tells him to start thinking of yourself by that name from this moment on. I hadn't mentioned this before, but it's now worth mentioning that we never get to learn any of the two names. While we get to learn all the names of all the other characters, his remains a mystery. So a big part of our identity is related to our name. The fact that it is not mentioned contributes to his invisibility. He takes the job at the Brotherhood to pay Mary back, but he becomes attracted to the idea of creating a legacy for himself within the organization. This organization is supposedly working to create a better world for everyone, but from the very beginning, we learn that something's wrong with it. At the party, Emma tells Jack, "But don't you think he should be a little blacker?" She thinks that the narrator is not black enough to be heard and followed by the Harlem community. Also, one of the other members asks the narrator to sing at a party, and when it is said that he doesn't, he answers, "No, nonsense. All colored people sing." So, one more time, the narrator's identity is defined by the color of his skin. Not black enough to be a leader in the Harlem, but black enough to be able to sing well. In order to work for this organization, he not only gets a new name, but new clothes, a new apartment, and he's asked not to be in touch with his family and to put aside your past. He takes up a new identity to please the white members of this organization. From the very beginning, Brother Jack tells the narrator, who has become a chief spokesman, to say what the people want to hear, but say it in a way they'll do what we wish. So most of his speeches won't be about what he thinks, but about what the organization wants him to say. Brother Jack uses the narrator as a tool to carry out a plan. When the narrator is questioned about Clifton's funeral, he answers, "We went ahead on my personal responsibility," to what Brother Jack replies mockingly, "This is astounding." Brother Jack then tells him, "You weren't hired to think." I guess that's why he spent his first 4 months with Brother Hambro getting indoctrinated. This way he wouldn't think, but repeat what he had learned. Defending his actions still, the narrator states that, "I saw a chance to rally the people, so I acted." But the Brotherhood doesn't want him to be a free agent. They just want to tell him what to do. Once again, his identity is challenged, but the narrator fights back for a just cause. After all, an unarmed man was killed. Still, in the Brotherhood, we furnish all ideas. The reality is that this organization and Brother Jack have no real desire to improve the life of the Harlem residents. Before the riot, Brother Hambro tells him of his new directives. He says, "That's regrettable. It is unfortunate, brother, but your members will have to be sacrificed." But how can he let go of his people? The narrator said, "All I could tell Harlem was to have hope when there was no hope." Toward the end of the story, it can be seen that the Brotherhood has completely abandoned its Harlem members. The narrator then tells Raz, "I am no longer their brother," I shouted. "They want a race riot, and I'm against it. The more of us who are killed, the better they like." So Brother Jack is only interested in gathering personal power and wealth, and to Jack, the narrator is a Sambo doll, someone he can manipulate. However, the narrator doesn't leave the organization. He says, "It was the only historically meaningful life that I could live. If I left it, I'd be nowhere." So he decides to stay, but not to be blind anymore. "I couldn't leave, and I had to keep in contact in order to fight. But I would never be the same, never. After tonight, I would never look the same or feel the same. Just what I'd be, I didn't know. I couldn't go back to what I was, which wasn't much, but I'd lost too much to be what I was." He would lie and deceive to get his way. He said, late that afternoon at headquarters, I reported that things were quieting down and that we were getting a large part of the community interested in a cleanup campaign. When I handed my fake list of new members, they responded with enthusiasm. He found a way to do what he wants, in spite of opposition. In the end, he kind of interprets what the grandfather's message in his death had meant. For many years, he had thought of what overcoming with yeses meant, and he had always kept this piece of advice, this riddle, at the back of his head. It haunted him from time to time during the whole story. At first, he thought it meant that he had to obey white people, that he had to conform to the white man's expectations. However, later on he decides that his grandfather meant to pretend to obey or agree when he says, "I didn't know what my grandfather had meant, but I was ready to test his advice. I had overcome them with yeses, undermined them with grins, and I'd agree them to death and destruction." As time goes by, he begins to see that invisibility isn't a bad thing. When he puts on the hat and the glasses and people mistake him for another person, he's able to pursue his own goals without others' expectations getting in the way. In disguise, he does what he wishes and creates his own rewards. He's able to hide in plain sight. It is also by being invisible that the narrator learns to change society. In the novel's prologue, the narrator wonders how an invisible man could be held accountable for his actions. In darkness, he's able to become himself. He rids himself from his baggage, his black baggage, and he creates light. Throughout the novel, he fills the briefcase with objects and he carries them everywhere. They're a symbol of enslavement to the white man. His brotherhood name, the letter where he's threatened, his diploma, the Sambo doll, pieces of Mary's broken bank, which is another Sambo image, and Brother Tarp's leg chain from when he was a slave. He carries the black people's legacy in his briefcase, which acts as his own leg chain. It is so important for him that he even runs through a fire to retrieve it, and he's unable to leave it behind. For a second, I hesitated, but I'd had it for so long to leave it now. Only by setting the papers on fire, the ones from the briefcase, partly to keep warm, but also to have a torch, to have light, he's able to free himself and to become himself. The fire creates the light in which he becomes visible. So he writes this story underground, using 1,369 light bulbs. Again, a light reference that can be associated to his visibility. When he finishes writing the novel, he re-enters the world because he has a role in society now. He has a sense of self-identity and a voice. The end of his story is also just the beginning. He states that he finally has realized that he must honor his individual complexity and remain true to his own identity. Ultimately, the narrator is desperate to create a unique identity, one that will be remembered in history, which would be impossible if he remains invisible. So, since the end is the beginning, I like to head back to the prologue and focus on a few sentences from this quote. "All my life I had been looking for something, and everywhere I turned, someone tried to tell me what it was. Then, I was looking for myself, and asking everyone except myself questions which I, and only I, could answer. That I am nobody but myself. But first I had to discover that I am an invisible man." This story is so rich that we could analyze it from many other perspectives, and I look forward to doing so in the forum. Thank you very much.